You finish work today feeling completely wrung out. Your inbox reads 0. You answered every message within the hour it arrived. You sat through 3 meetings and said something useful in each one. By any reasonable measure you were busy for 9 straight hours. And yet if someone asked what you actually built today, what became true in the world because you personally thought about it hard enough for it to exist, you would struggle to name a single thing. That gap, between feeling exhausted and having produced anything of lasting value, is not a discipline problem, and it is not a time management problem in the way most advice treats it. It is what happens when almost every hour of your working day gets spent in a state your brain was never designed to sustain for long, half attending to a dozen small things at once, none of them held in mind for long enough to actually matter. This is worth sitting with before we go any further, because the instinct is to blame yourself for it. You tell yourself you got distracted, that you should have had more willpower, that a better version of you would have closed the tabs and put down the phone. But willpower is not really the variable doing the damage here. What is actually happening is closer to a set of specific, mechanical processes running quietly in your head every time you switch from one thing to another, processes that would produce roughly the same exhausted, empty feeling in almost anyone subjected to the same conditions for long enough. Today we are going to open up 3 of those mechanisms directly, each one backed by a specific study rather than a slogan, and then look at what happens, measured in an actual human body, when someone removes the conditions that cause them. This pattern rarely announces itself as a single dramatic failure. It shows up as a slow, cumulative erosion, the essay that takes 4 hours to write when it should take 90 minutes would have solved it, the report that has to be read twice because nothing from the first pass actually landed anywhere. You do not usually notice the erosion while it is happening. You notice it later, at the end of a day that felt completely full and somehow produced very little, and the natural response is to work even more hours to compensate, which only spreads the same fragmented attention across a longer stretch of time instead of repairing the fragmentation itself. There is a name for the alternative to this fragmented state, and it comes from a working computer scientist rather than a productivity guru with something to sell. Cal Newport is a professor of computer science at Georgetown University. He earned his doctorate at MIT in 2009 with a dissertation on distributed computation on unreliable radio channels, the kind of technical problem that cannot be solved in fragments, since a mathematical proof either holds together completely in your head across a sustained stretch of concentration or it simply does not exist yet. In 2016 he published Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World, and the argument sitting at the center of that book is a genuine distinction, not a rebranding of an old idea dressed up in a new title. Deep work, in Newport's own framing, is time spent, without interruption, on a cognitively demanding task that pushes your abilities to their current limit. Shallow work is nearly everything else that fills a modern job: email, status updates, quick logistical back and forth, the kind of task you could execute half distracted and barely notice a difference in the outcome. Newport's claim is not that shallow work is worthless or that email is some kind of moral failing. His claim is that shallow work has quietly expanded to occupy nearly the entire work, paying a real premium for the rarer, harder kind of thinking, and that this substitution happens for identifiable, mechanical reasons sitting inside your own head, not because you personally lack discipline compared to people who seem to get more done. The reason this distinction matters more now than it might have a generation ago is fairly straightforward. A great deal of shallow work can already be handled adequately by a search engine, a template, or increasingly by an algorithm, which means its market value keeps drifting downward year over year. The work that genuinely requires emphasis, real judgment, real creative or technical problem solving, is becoming simultaneously rarer and more valuable, precisely because so few people spend enough of an ordinary day in the state that actually produces it. That would be only a mild inconvenience if deep concentration were simply a switch you could flip at will whenever you decided you needed it. It is not. 3 specific mechanisms make it genuinely hard to reach and easy to lose within minutes, and once you can see those mechanisms clearly, the difficulty stops feeling like a personal failing you need to an ordinary human mind operating in a distraction-saturated environment, the kind of friction you can actually work around once you know exactly where it lives. The first mechanism explains why answering one quick email wedged between 2 pieces of real work costs you far more than the 90 seconds it visibly takes to type. Sophie Lee Roy, a management professor who named and directly studied this effect, calls it attention residue. As you move from one task to the next, some part of your attention does not fully make the transition along with you. It stays behind, still quietly processing the task you just physically left. Leroy describes this residue as strongest under 3 specific conditions: when the prior task was left unfinished rather than properly completed, when you were interrupted out of it rather than choosing on your own terms to stop, and when you are anticipating that whatever comes next will force you to rush through it. In each of those 3 situations, some portion of your working memory keeps quietly returning to the thing you did not properly close out, the way a browser tab left open in the background still consumes a slice of your computer's memory even while your eyes are pointed at an entirely different window. The cost this produces is not abstract or merely subjective. With fewer cognitive resources actually available for the task now in front of you, your performance on that task measurably suffers, and Leroy's own account of the mechanism is specific on this point. The effect is worst precisely when the new task is the one that most needed your full attention in the first place, which is exactly backwards from what you would design if you were building a mind on purpose. This is the detail that should genuinely reframe how you think about a quick reply squeezed between 2 real tasks. It is never actually quick, no matter how it feels in the message and then returning at full capacity to the work you left behind. You are importing a small, lingering fragment of that message into everything you do for some unmeasured stretch of time afterward, and you have no reliable felt sense of how much processing power it is quietly occupying, because the residue does not announce itself the way physical fatigue does. It does not ache. It just quietly subtracts from whatever comes next, and you experience the subtraction only as a task taking longer than it should have, or as an answer that arrives slightly duller than the one you were actually capable of giving. You are 40 minutes into genuinely difficult work, the kind that requires holding several moving pieces in mind at once, and a message arrives that seems to need only a glance. You give it the glance. You answer in under a minute. Then you turn back to the difficult work only to find that the several moving pieces you were holding in mind have partially scattered, not because the glance itself was demanding, but because some part of you is still quietly resolving what that message meant, whether it required anything further, whether you answered it well enough. Rebuilding the scattered pieces from scratch does not take 1 minute. It takes considerably longer, and it happens invisibly, which is exactly why the habit of a quick glance survives despite how expensive it actually is. The second mechanism is what happens in the minutes immediately after an interruption actually lands, and here the numbers come from watching real knowledge workers go about an ordinary day rather than from a laboratory task with college sophomores. In a 2008 study, Gloria Mark and her colleagues followed 36 professionals, managers, financial analysts, software developers, engineers, and project leaders, for 3 full working days apiece, with researchers physically timing every single event to the second rather than relying on anyone's memory or self-report gathered afterward. What the data showed first is that people are being interrupted constantly by their own choices nearly as much as by anyone or anything else. Self-interruptions, meaning the worker broke off from what they were doing without anyone or anything external forcing the break, accounted for roughly 44% of all interruptions recorded. Workers switched between distinct projects on average every 10 minutes and 29 seconds, and spent an average of only about 3 minutes and 5 seconds on any single event before something, whether external or self-generated, pulled their attention elsewhere. Zoom in further and the fragmentation gets even finer. On average, people spent only about 2 minutes and 11 seconds on any given device or window before switching again. When an actual interruption does happen, the data show something that will sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever lost a sentence mid-thought. Most interrupted work does eventually get resumed the same day, roughly 82% of it by Mark's own count. But it takes real time to get back to it. An average number understates the disruption, because Mark's data show that after an interruption you typically do not walk straight back to the task you left. You pass through something like 2 other intervening tasks first, drifting through a short chain of half-attended activity before you finally land back on the thing that actually mattered in the first place. That detail matters more than it might first appear. It means the honest cost of an interruption is not the interruption itself plus a clean, direct return trip. It is the interruption plus a short, disorganized detour through unrelated activity, glancing at something else, before attention finally reassembles itself around the original task. Multiply that detour by however many times it happens across a single day, and the total time spent in that in-between, half-focused state can easily rival, or exceed, the time actually spent in genuine, productive concentration. Stack that pattern across a 9-hour day containing dozens of both self-generated and externally imposed interruptions, and the arithmetic stops being a story about losing 23 minutes on one occasion. It becomes a description of a day built almost entirely out of re-entries, a working life spent perpetually walking back into a room you only half remember having left, over and over, until the workday ends and you cannot point to the thing you actually did in it. The first two mechanisms explain why shallow, fragmented work quietly erodes your capacity minute by minute across a single day. The third mechanism explains something different and in some ways more important, why deep, undistracted work compounds your capacity year over year, and it comes from a study that was never about office interruptions at all. In 1993, psychologist Anders Ericsson, working with Ralph Kramp and Clemens Teschromer, studied violin students at the Music Academy of West Berlin, sorted by the faculty itself into three distinct groups: the best students, judged by their own teachers to have genuine potential for careers as international soloists, a good group one tier below them in judged potential, and a third group whose most likely professional destination was teaching music rather than performing it at the highest level. Rather than attempt to measure raw talent directly, the researchers asked each student to reconstruct, year by year, how many hours they had spent in solitary practice since first picking up the instrument, then multiply those weekly estimates out across the calendar to arrive at a cumulative lifetime total for each person. By age 18, the best group had accumulated an estimated 7,410 hours of solitary practice. The good group one tier below had accumulated an estimated 5,301 hours. The group most likely to end up teaching rather than performing at the highest level had accumulated an estimated 3,420 hours. The researchers described their own central finding in direct terms. There was, in their own account, complete correspondence between a group's judged skill level and its average accumulated practice time spent alone with the instrument. This is the finding that got compressed, in the years since its publication, into the pop culture shorthand of a simple 10,000-hour rule for mastering anything, and it is worth pausing honestly on exactly where that compressed version goes wrong. A later, more careful look back at Ericsson's own reported numbers found that the best group's individual practice hours varied so widely from student to student that the range surrounding their group average, running from roughly 2,894 hours on the low end to roughly 11,926 hours on the high end, actually swallows the good group's average of 5,301 hours whole. In other words, some students who reached elite status had practiced barely more than the good group's typical member, and some had practiced more than 4 times as much. Hours of solitary practice clearly separate these three groups from each other when you look at group averages. They do not function as a clean, universal threshold that reliably guarantees elite mastery for any single individual student who happens to clear it. What survives this more careful scrutiny is not a magic number you can hit and then relax. It is the underlying mechanism itself, sustained, deliberate, undistracted practice, the specific kind that keeps pushing just past your current comfortable ability rather than pleasantly rehearsing what you already do well, is the thing that reliably separates these three groups from each other, not raw accumulated hours by themselves in isolation, and certainly not innate talent treated as the whole explanation. The uncomfortable implication for anyone hoping to skip the hard part is that there does not appear to be a shortcut hiding inside these numbers. There is only a difference in how spent. If attention residue and interruption cost together explain the daily damage caused by a fragmented working life, and deliberate practice explains the long-term payoff of the undistracted alternative, the natural next question is what actually happens if someone removes the thing causing the damage, rather than simply theorizing about it from a safe distance. Gloria Mark answered that question directly in a 2012 study conducted with civilian employees at the Army's Natick Soldier Systems Center, a workforce split evenly between men and women. For part of the study period, for 5 full consecutive workdays, that email access was cut off entirely. Mark's team logged which computer windows people worked in and for how long throughout each day, and separately fitted the same workers with heart rate monitors, so that stress could be measured as a physiological signal rather than simply asked about afterward in a survey people might answer generously. With email running normally, people switched windows on their screens an average of 37 times per hour. With email removed for those 5 days, that figure fell to roughly 18 times per hour, close to half the original rate. The heart rate data told a strikingly similar story from a completely different angle. With email active, workers held a steady, elevated heart rate consistent with a sustained physiological state of high alert, the body's way of staying braced for the next incoming demand on its attention. Without email, heart rates became noticeably more natural and more variable, the pattern you would expect from someone who is not continuously bracing for an interruption that might arrive at any second. Mark summarized her own team's result in plain, direct language. multitask less and experience less stress. Other, separate research has linked that same steady, high alert heart rate pattern to elevated cortisol, a hormone closely associated with chronic stress, though it is worth being precise that this particular study measured heart rate directly rather than measuring cortisol itself. None of this means email is some kind of enemy to be eliminated entirely. It means the constant switching email invites is doing something measurable to your body as well as to your output, and encouragingly, it means the damage appears to be reversible considerably faster than most people would assume, within a matter of days rather than months of dedicated effort. 5 workdays was enough to move both the window switching rate and the heart rate pattern, which suggests the fragmented state most people treat as simply how modern work feels is closer to a response to a specific, removable condition than to a fixed trait of the job itself, or of the person doing it. Put these 3 mechanisms and the one intervention study side by side, and a single coherent shape starts to emerge from what otherwise looks like for unrelated pieces of research. Attention residue tells you that a task you have not properly finished keep away from it. Interruption cost tells you that once you are pulled away from something, whether by a colleague, a notification, or your own restless hand reaching for a new tab, getting back to genuine full engagement takes far longer than the interruption itself ever visibly lasted, and that you rarely even travel there directly. Deliberate practice tells you that the sustained, undistracted version of effort is not merely more pleasant or more virtuous than the fragmented version. It is functionally a different activity altogether, the only one of the two that reliably builds new capability over months and years rather than simply spending down whatever capability you already happen to have today. And the 2012 intervention tells you that none of this is a fixed condition you are stuck with. Change the conditions that produce constant switching, and the switching itself measurably drops, along with the physiological stress that appears to ride alongside it. None of these findings requires you to become a fundamentally different kind of person, someone more naturally disciplined or more innately talented than you currently are. They describe how an ordinary brain behaves under a specific, identifiable set of conditions: constant task switching, chronic interruption from outside and from yourself in roughly equal measure, and work chopped into pieces too small and too frequently disrupted to ever reach the difficulty threshold where real skill actually gets built rather than merely maintained. Change those conditions, and on the evidence assembled here, the outcome changes along with them, not because you found some new reserve of willpower in the moment, but because you stopped asking your own attention to repeatedly do something it was never actually built to do well in the first place. There is also a quieter implication buried in the deliberate practice numbers that is easy to miss on a first pass. Tolerate the most hours of practice in general. They were separated by who consistently practiced in the specific way that stays undistracted and stays just past the edge of current ability, which is close to the exact opposite of the fragmented, interrupted, self-interrupted state the first 2 mechanisms describe. Seen this way, the 3 findings stop looking like 3 separate stories bolted together for one video. They look like the same underlying currency, sustained attention, being spent in different amounts and in different ways, first showing what happens when it leaks out in quietly accumulates when it does not leak, measured across years instead of hours. It is worth being honest about the limits of this too. None of what has been described here is a clinical diagnosis, and it is not a substitute for addressing real, persistent burnout. If exhaustion or an inability to concentrate has become severe, or has lasted for a long stretch of time despite genuine effort to change the conditions around it, that is a conversation worth having with an actual doctor rather than something to solve alone with a scheduling trick borrowed from a psychology video. What the research above describes is a mechanism operating in an ordinary brain under ordinary conditions, not a verdict on your character, and not a diagnosis of anything more serious sitting underneath it. Here is a genuine question worth sitting with after all of this. Think back to the last time you actually sat down to do the one piece of work that mattered most this week, the thing you would have named first if someone had asked you directly. Now count, honestly, how many minutes passed before the first self-interruption arrived, before you reached for a tab, a phone, a small task that felt productive in the moment but was quietly not the thing you had actually sat down to do. Tell me that number in the comments, because most people who actually count it are startled by how small it turns out to be. In the next video we leave the question of attention entirely and turn to judgment itself, to 2 competing systems running inside your own head every single time you make a decision, one fast and one slow, and why it is so often the fast one you trust the most in the exact moment it is about to get you the most wrong. That is thinking fast and slow, and it is where we go next.